Chapter 44. Caleb trailed his fingers across the windowsill in the guest chamber. Hundreds of the sword flag flowers waved in the wind below. This narrow view looked too peaceful. His brother stepped up behind him. Gladioli blooms were stuck behind his pointed ears, and he grinned at Caleb. He held a long stem in his hand like a sword and stabbed it into the air. "If only our army were as numerous," Caleb murmured. "At least our enemies are here instead of spread over the countryside where we cannot control them." The stem drooped. "We can't control them here, brother." Caleb pulled a couple of the flowers away from his brother's face. "Come, we should see our fate." He turned and walked out of the room. Lady Evelyn awaited them at the base of the vaulted tower stairs. She curtsied. "My princes, it was just as we expected. They have arrived." The last flower slipped from the younger prince's fingers. "It's really happening." Caleb nodded. He stepped past the lady and marched up the stairs. He pushed his head above the trapdoor and pulled himself up with only a grimace. Moonrise Castle's central tower rose twice the height of the rest of the fortress. Green shoots and buds curled around the ornate wooden railings and supports, despite the icy wind. A stream from a fountain spiraled around the tower before disappearing into the floor. Absalom followed him onto the tower. "What's in here?" His brother squatted by a small wooden chest next to the trapdoor. He waved a hand over it and pulled it back as if it had burned him. Caleb spun toward him. Absalom forced a grin. "Magic." The older prince breathed out. He let his gaze fall to the valley floor. The Kelin army stood in formation behind the bunched and disheveled ranks of Senna's cultists. In front of them were howling, bucking rows of Calvar. Their cries carried on the wind up to the tower. Harnesses held them in check, but it wouldn't last. The leather already looked discolored against the strain of the animals. The prince lowered his gaze to his army, hidden behind Moonrise's walls. They seemed so few, and instead of a fortress, the castle felt like a prison. Their only hope rested in holding the walls that surrounded them. He looked to the sun. It was already losing its height, and his shadow was fast growing longer at his feet. He stiffened as the Storm Reader's light crept through the valley, and a fog emanated from it toward the castle, obscuring the Kelin army in grayness. He steeled his jaw. So it seemed they had chosen to amplify the mist. And why not? It appeared they had victory in hand, so why not make it into a legend? "You could be your father." A silken voice rose like an evening star behind him. Lady Evelyn stepped onto the tower. He turned his gaze back to the fields below. "I can only hope that I carry a quarter of his character. He wouldn't have needed to take such a foolhardy risk to win a war." "Perhaps not, my prince," the lady replied. But he was unable to finish the last one. Everyone was still staring. Dare, Jacob, Thistle, Carrick, and the cultists. The blood dripped off the nearest man's unmoving knife. Bits of liver clung to the blade. Dare gulped, feeling the bile burning in the back of her throat. They'd appeared through what looked like a stone wall behind the altar. A wooden staircase led upstairs from the cramped space, but there were more than a few cultists between them and the escape path. She found herself squinting against the overwhelming yellow light. She sensed Thistle relax beside her, and from the corner of her eye she saw him beginning to smile. He stepped forward, orange eyes alight in the flames. One of them straightened his black robe and sauntered toward them.
"We gave you as many soldiers as you needed. Now the rest of us can continue our feast in peace."
Dare's hands tightened on the Palin's sword as she glanced back at the guts on the altar. Jacob moved in front of her, keeping a straight face. She huffed and looked down and saw her sword in color. She forgot about the cultists. Her heart beat faster as she stared at it. She remembered what the prince had told her about Palin's using melted gems. The 2 lines dancing around the hilt and pommel had to be gems, one strand emerald, the other sapphire. The blade shone blue and gold in the orange torchlight. Thistle snorted.
You call your men soldiers? They are weak.
The cultist's face froze. The Kelin took another step forward and pulled his sword free of its sheath. All sounds went blank as he spun it over and around his wrist, almost lazily. The man in front of him tried to speak, but the sword voided his voice. Thistle stopped moving the weapon.
Because of you, the lead cultist snarled. Our brothers were exposed in Second Akron. We had to flee. But we are leading you to victory over the elves. Something you did not dream of on your own. Of course. But you promised to rid us of the King of Fairlith, and now he's trying to rout us from his kingdom. Because of your own stupidity when you let some children beat you in Dulingar.
Hey! Dare blurted. It fell on deaf ears. Thistle took another deliberate step forward.
That was not the only mistake you made.
He leveled the weapon and stilled it.
You killed my wife.
He thrust. In silence, the cultist folded down onto the Kelin's blade. His mouth gaped, his face raged red, and his chest deflated as he screamed with all his might when Thistle ripped the sword back. Yet, there was no sound. The cultist collapsed around the weapon. The moment shattered, and the rest of the devil worshippers clawed for their weapons, most of them jagged and ceremonial. Dare leaped over the altar, the Palin's sword flashing against the torchlight. Jacob rounded the platform. He sliced his axe across the chest of the nearest cultist, smashing the man's own knife into his ribs. He was dead before the axe cut into his body. Carrick pushed his spectacles back up his nose, bellowed, and leaped forward. Dare grunted and waited for her opponent to attack. She blocked his blow, and when the momentum turned to her move, she not only riposted but kicked his knee out at the same time. He swore as his leg gave out, and he missed his parry. She stabbed his chest, the Palin's sword flowing like sharpened silk at her command. Thistle, only a few steps in front of her, brought his bloody sword down repeatedly in silence. Dare could see them scream, and she felt as if in a dream to see but not hear it. Jacob and Thistle made quick work of the rest of the cultists. She looked around. The last one ran behind the altar. A web of red light erupted between his fingers, and she felt a rush of air sweep by her. Jacob kicked the altar, crashing its mass into the cultist just as the devil worshipper's spell exploded in his hands, sending wooden shards and guts flying out over the room. Dare breathed out, wondering what that magic would have done if the altar hadn't have taken the blast for them. She rubbed her ear. It felt like it was stuffed with something, and she couldn't hear quite right. She knelt to wipe her sword on one of the dead cultist's robes, but the blood simply slipped off the metal. She held it up and nearly dropped it in surprise as the nicks and burrs from the fight were healing themselves, leaving the blade as sharp and perfect as when she'd found it. She grinned and thrust the sword toward the ceiling. "Yeah! You have made an enemy of me! On this blade I swear that Senna is my enemy, and wherever I find a follower of his—"
Dare?
Jacob sighed.
Who are you talking to? They're all dead.
Her cheeks warmed as her face flushed. She ducked her gaze, and it landed on what was left of the splintered altar, with a few wooden spikes still dripping from the slaughter. Laughter fountained up.
Oh yes, child. Come to me.
She twisted around, raising her sword, but the laughter had no origin. It was everywhere, in everything, and growing in intensity. The voice was as fierce and heavy as an angry ocean, and she was a single drop of water fighting against all of the sea's currents.
If this is how weak you've become, I bid you the grandest welcome to try again.
Dare fought for breath. The air in the room seemed to be boiling now. She roared, "Fine! I will!" The laughter exploded to deafening levels.
Your life isn't even worth being slain in my name right now."
Then the sensation cut off. She reeled for balance as Jacob hauled her to her feet. When had she fallen? She glanced down. She was still holding the Palin's sword, at least. He looked at her quizzically.
"Fine you will what?"
She tried to focus on him. "You all didn't just hear—" The wave receded, and she realized she'd promised a god what she couldn't deliver. And she had no idea what she'd vowed to try again. Or try for the first time, she corrected herself. She caught Carrick gawking at her, but he looked away. She lowered her sword as she exhaled. The knight was still staring as hard as granite at her, so she muttered, "Just, remembering what the Kelin did to me and Kelin." He flattened out a grim smile.
"If this was going to be a problem, you should have told me."
"Yes, sir." Thistle dropped to his knees, his sword silently falling beside him. He tumbled forward until his head hit the floor. His shoulders quivered, and a tear slipped down his cheek. Dare looked away and kept her mouth pressed closed. Jacob wiped his axe clean before sheathing it, ignoring Thistle. She shuffled her feet, watching the knight. The Kemen's hand shot out and retrieved the sword. He rose to his feet as if pulled straight up by a rope. He spun.
"Move."
Carrick stepped aside.
"You're going back,"
Jacob stated.
"Thalon is all I have."
The knight nodded. "But—" Dare heard her own voice peter out. She moved to the side as Thistle pushed past her to the wall behind where the altar had been. He extended a hand. It didn't pass through the wall. He sheathed his sword, flattened his hands against the wall, and pushed. He pressed harder, even shoving his shoulders and face up against the wall. "It's gone," Dare whispered.
"The explosion,"
Carrick rumbled. Jacob looked conflicted, but he shook his head at Thistle.
"Your call, but we're leaving."
The Kemen remained motionless. Dare tensed as the knight waved her and Carrick forward. She and the dwarf tiptoed after him up the creaking wooden stairs toward a door. Jacob pushed it open with a foot, and the air smelled sweeter. He leaned back inside.
"All right. Dare, Carrick, keep your weapons low. We don't want to frighten folks."
The three of them eased into a large avenue. Stars shone overhead, and only a few walkers strolled down the street. The giant knight bore down on the first people they saw. Dare felt a twinge of sympathy as a man and woman, who were holding hands, gripped each other so tightly that they both squeaked. Jacob loomed over them.
Good evening. Do you mind me asking where the hell we are?"
The woman opened her mouth a couple of times before any sound came out. "It's Tenmar City." The knight snorted.
"Not bad."
He turned to the others.
"There's a tree path in their central square. Only they don't know what it is, so we may cause a scene."
"Where is Tenmar City?" Dare asked. "It's the capital of the kingdom of Tenmar," the woman supplied, eyeing them as if they had arrived from the moon. "Magic users?"
"Far east and north of Thalith, Dare,"
Jacob replied, ignoring the woman.
"Well, lady, where is the central square from here?"
She just stared.
"We're in a hurry."
The couple pointed down the road, too dumbstruck to speak. Dare started after the others, but stopped and glanced over her shoulder. Behind, with aching slowness, Thistle trudged after them.